Christian Parenting.
Hi, Leigh. Welcome to the Christian Parenting Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Steph. I'm excited about this conversation. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm very thrilled to have you. We are continuing on with our school series, and just talking about all the options that parents have is just like a very overwhelming topic. So I'm grateful that you're willing to be here to talk about homeschooling and what that looks like for you and the benefits and the challenges and everything that comes with it.
Yeah, I'm all for it. I love that parents are having this conversation and making intentional choices for their children for that year. And so I'm excited to be able to present another option for people.
Yeah. I really appreciate that you just said for that year, because sometimes I think parents forget that you can change your mind.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Like you are not making a choice for forever. It can
Right.
be a little bit at a time and you can go do something else. So thanks for that little reminder, because I think that's important.
Yes.
But let's start. Let's just tell people about you and then about your family and get to know you a little bit before we start talking about the family that you homeschool.
Sure. So my name is Leigh Nguyen, and my husband and I have been married for 24 years. We right now have two young adult children that are currently living at home. It's kind of that season of life. I heard somebody say it's like a boomerang. They go out, they come back, they go out, they come back. So 22-year-old and a 20-year-old. And so I am down to homeschooling just my last one, who is 17. So we live in central New York, in the state of New York, and have been homeschooling for 14 years now. And yeah, that's kind of us in a nutshell. And I enjoy encouraging other moms to homeschool because it wasn't something I thought I would do. And I hear that a lot from people. So I love to talk about homeschool. It's one of my top things I want to talk about.
Well, good, because that's what we're covering today. So tell us about your journey into homeschooling. If it was not something you thought that you were going to do, I feel like I hear that a lot. Either people are like, I was homeschooled, this is the path I'm going down, I 100% know it, or it's like a complete surprise. So what led you to decide you were going to homeschool?
Yeah, it was a complete surprise for me. I would call myself an unlikely person to homeschool. And I had one family within my family, an aunt and uncle who homeschooled their kids. So I knew of the word, but I never really saw them homeschool. They lived far enough away from us that I didn't really know. It's at holidays and we'd have a good time together with their kids and didn't really understand it. Get married, have kids, and I went to public school. My husband went to private school. So both of us were in the school system. And so it just felt natural to just put our kids into school. And so my daughter turns 5 and she was actually almost 6 when she started at kindergarten at the local school. It was a great little school and she loved it. But I remember putting her on the bus and it just never really quite felt right. I was like, oh, this is so hard to be separated from her after all this time. And I was like, well, I'll get used to it. Long story short, never really quite got used to that, but then had some, again, it wasn't the school, it was her. She was just not thriving anymore. A lot of stress, a lot of anxiety that came along with school for her. In the meantime, then her younger brother starts kindergarten and he was a force to be reckoned with at home, let alone at school. And so that was also a double concern. And this thought just came to my mind because I did have one friend at that time that homeschooled. She had 3 boys. And I was like, if she can homeschool 3 boys, then I could probably, throw a girl in there too. And so at the time that I also had a preschooler, my youngest son was a preschool age. And I would say to her, I don't know how you do it. I could never homeschool. And she would just look at me and say, yes, you could. And it was just a matter of time till I felt God just saying, just try it. Just do it. Just look into it. And I was like, okay. And so I made a phone call to her one time then, and I said, so I think we might homeschool. And I just started bawling my eyes out and cry because it just felt like such a big thing because that's why I like to say, let's decide for this year. Even though I felt like this was a really big decision, let's just try this out and see how this goes and see how we feel. I mean, we never quite looked back, but got together with that friend and started homeschooling the next homeschool year. The next school year. And so I would have had a 3rd grader, a 1st grader, and a preschooler at that time.
And they went all the way through.
Yes. Yep. So all the way through. And so the older 2 did start off with school. And then my youngest I say that he's my great experiment since he's been the one that I've done all the way through.
Yeah. All the way through. Yeah. And I wonder, it will be curious to see what happens if they decide to homeschool.
They all say yes.
They all say yes.
But there's going to be another person that's going to be factored into that.
Yeah. Yes.
So, but they do say that it's important. They see the benefit in it. And even though maybe at times I didn't love it because I didn't want to have to do the math work, I'm like, we wouldn't have loved it either way because there's math
No
work
one
at
wants to do the math
yeah,
work.
at every school. So I'm like, so they all say it's important to them. So we'll see. I'm curious as well. And I hope that they do. And I hope that I'm allowed to be a little part of it, whether it's, take them on field trips or do some fun stuff with, future grandkids someday.
Yeah, that would be amazing. So tell me kind of like what for you a typical day or a week looked like in your homeschool. And then with 3 kids, like how do you make sure that each kid is getting their needs met? Because they're all different. They're all good at different subjects and have different learning styles. Like, what is that? How do you incorporate different needs into your day? What does that all look like?
Yeah, so I'm going to approach this from when my kids were younger because my
Hmm.
days now look so much different when it's just a 17-year-old who's pretty well independent. So let's focus then to maybe about 10 years ago or so
Hmm.
when I would have had 3 in elementary school age range. And I would say that probably the hardest years were when I had an elementary age, middle, and high school. And so I'm trying to figure out the high school all while trying to teach the youngest reading and math facts. And then the middle
Hmm.
schooler, mostly at that age, I mean, he continued to be a force to be reckoned with. So just
We all have one.
keeping him on track, keeping him in the house, keeping him to what maybe he needed to do. And how our days became it was a bit more organic. When we first started homeschooling, I approached it from a time schedule and then realized that that wasn't really going to quite work with kids. And so
Hmm.
our days just kind of be the good days, we'll say, because there's some days that are, there's ups and downs. And so the goal always was for us to do some family style learning. A lot of families call it morning time or morning basket. There's some authors who call it that. And I always wanted to start with that. Although if they got ready for the day, got their chores done, bed made, breakfast and everything, they were able to start off on some independent stuff. So I preferred having a time that we would start our morning time, our family learning together, because it also gave me a deadline that I needed to be ready for the day and that would keep me focused and keep me on track. So typically around that age, it was like 9 o'clock. I would say we're all meeting here in the living room at this time. And we would go through our family learning type of subjects, things like Bible, if there was science or history, anything that we were doing together. And then we would always end with a fun read aloud. But then there was also the independent work because, as you're saying, kids are of different ages. And so when you are teaching a second grader math, that's going to be different than a fourth grader math, and obviously a lot different than a preschooler math. And there was a lot of bouncing around, and I had to learn. It's just like when you have one child and then you add a second child, and you have to learn to balance your time with both of them. It's the same thing, but you're just doing it with academics and with curriculum
Hmm.
and also then teaching them to be independent as well. And so when it would come to, say, time for math, I would do a lesson with one child, and during that time, the other two would just be maybe doing some independent parts of their math, or maybe doing their language arts, or just reading a book. And then I get done with that math lesson with that child, and then they would go ahead and do their work. And then I would jump to the next one. It was a lot of jumping around. And I remember being really exhausted mentally and emotionally by the end of the day. It wasn't very physical. Here we are just at a table and I'm just bouncing around to them.
Right.
But it did take a lot out of me. And the beginning of every homeschool year, I remember being exhausted every night falling to bed and being like, it's not like I ran a marathon today, but my mind did.
Right.
Yeah. So that's kind of a little bit of how that would look. We did 5 days of homeschool most years. Some years we did like 4 days, and then Fridays would be maybe a field trip, especially if it was sometime in the fall or in the spring when the weather was nice to take field trips. So that's also an option that we picked at some points in some certain years.
Yeah, that's so fun. Okay, so you talked about how like some of your family learning you did in the morning, and that would have like Bible time. Like how else do you get to weave faith into your curriculum and into your days because you have that flexibility when you're at home, you get to kind of decide what that's going to look like.
Right. So, as I mentioned briefly, that when we first started homeschooling, I was focused on just recreating the school at home. It's the only model of education that I knew.
Mm,
And I didn't see at first that we could weave our faith and weave the spiritual guidance and weave Bible time into what we were doing. And so it took me a few years. And I've had homeschool moms say, well, how do you fit this in? I'm having a hard time fitting my Bible time in. I'm like, no, you don't fit that in. That's the foundation. That's the beginning of it. And so when we did that family learning, when we would do that morning time, I knew that if I didn't do our Bible time first, it wasn't going to happen. It's just like when you're saying, well, I want to have my own personal devotions. For me, I know that I need to do it first thing in the morning. And For example, just yesterday morning, my son needed his car wasn't working. He needed a ride to work, and it threw my entire day off. And to be honest, I never got to it because that was the
Mhm.
time that I was going to do it. So I knew that in homeschool, I needed to focus on that first. That was going to be a primary thing. And then whatever else kind of happened, as long as you allow enough time. It's not like, okay, we'll start this at 11 and we have to be done by noon.
Yeah.
It was starting it at a decent time, and then we would move into other subjects. But it was also tying in the spiritual aspect by the curriculum that we chose. You can choose secular curriculum, you can choose faith based curriculum with a biblical worldview. And so when we came to our history and our science, we would choose things that came from a biblical worldview. So it would tie it into it. There were times that we would do because there's so many resources out there. I mean, there's even more now than there were.
Yeah.
I would find someone, I'm like, I want to do this and I want to do this and I want to do this and I want to do this. And so sometimes at breakfast, while you have a captive audience, you can do some Bible time then, do some type of devotional. My kids loved Adventures in Odyssey.
Mm.
And so at lunch, they would get to listen to a 20-minute episode. And it was, oh my goodness, lunchtime was great. It was actually quiet, except for listening to Mr. Whitaker and all those people, which was great. They would actually eat lunch. They would listen to the episode when it got done, that they were done. And then we're able to tie in the things that they were learning, the lessons that they were learning. And they still talk about that to this day. They still talk about some of the resources that we used. And, but also then just encouraging them in their own personal faith and providing them with resources, making sure that they have a Bible. When they're young, it's maybe a VeggieTales Bible. And as they get older, it's actually giving them a Bible that they of their very own. And I would also incorporate some type of Bible time into their subjects that they would have to do each
Mhm.
day, some type of something, just maybe wouldn't take them very long, but it was maybe them working through a certain Bible study.
So when you pick curriculum, so you said you had science and your language arts or history was biblical worldview. Did you also have some secular curriculum in there? Like, have you gone back and forth between different types of curriculum before you found your favorites and that worked for each kid? Like, how do you approach? Because I mean, I homeschooled for 1 year and there is so much out there. There's like 1 million options.
There are, and there's even more, and you can find so many more of them. It used to be you'd have to go to a homeschool convention
Mm-hmm.
to actually see the books, and now you can find everything on. I mean, I think most curriculum even you can purchase just on Amazon, but there are so many options, and it can feel overwhelming. And so I think it's good to recognize, especially when you start homeschooling, you might not know your child's learning style. You might not know their strengths and their weaknesses. You might not know that they have a hard time with math and that you need a certain type of math. And that's okay. That's you learn as you're going through the process and saying, this isn't going to work. You might say, well, I want to try this math program online, something on the computer. And you might have some kids that love it, that really do well. And it's through games. And you might have a kid who it just isn't working. They need pencil and paper and they don't need the distractions of the colored pictures or anything like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's looking at them and being like, it's okay to make changes. It's okay to make changes during the homeschool year. But then there's that fine line of just jumping around all the time,
Right.
especially when it comes to things like language arts or math, because there's a process of going through. If you keep jumping around, you might miss the multiplication math facts and suddenly you jump to division. And if you don't know the multiplication, the division is going to be a lot harder.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and just pushing through, like, you might just have a kid who doesn't like language arts, and they're not gonna like any curriculum that you choose because they don't wanna do it, you know? And so you're like, they're gonna complain every year, but they just have to figure that out and push through more than change the entire curriculum.
I absolutely agree. Yeah. So it's definitely looking and saying, is this just maybe like an attitude problem that they just don't want to do this? Or it just is hard for them. They struggle with it.
Yeah.
So going back to your question about whether it was a secular curriculum or having a biblical worldview, I tried to really focus on the science and the history being from a biblical worldview. Language arts, grammar, not always. There were some that we used and it didn't necessarily matter. Now, there might be some that are more fringe and you might want to be careful because of the sentences that they have the kids diagramming for language arts or the books that they're recommending that they read. Math is pretty well straightforward. And so yeah, so we kind of did an eclectic bit of curriculum throughout the years.
Yeah. Okay, and then I'm curious for people who are listening who are like, I can't imagine scheduling my day and like I'm super type B and unorganized, or I'm really bad at math. And so how on earth am I going to teach my kids math? Like people who kind of panic because like, I don't know if I can actually do this. Like, what would you say to that person? How do you kind of work through, am I going to be able to do this?
Yeah, so that sounds like when parents are focused on their weaknesses instead of focusing on our strengths.
Mm.
All has us wired differently. And I can, even though I have successfully graduated two homeschoolers and close to graduating a third, there was a lot of things that I didn't do great. They all turned out okay. I can compare myself to friends who are homeschooling and say, oh, they're doing a better job than I, but they're just doing it differently. And I have a friend that we would joke, she was just her kids were very science oriented. That's just how her brain was working. They would always be doing experiments, and her kids have all gone into science fields. And then she would lean over and say, but don't ask me about the history we did, because she knew that we really enjoyed doing a lot of history and a lot of read alouds, but that wasn't what she focused on. And her kids turned out okay, and mine turned out okay too. And so I think we can get really focused on our weaknesses instead of our strengths. But if you don't know the math, I mean, my kids got to higher level maths that I was like, I don't know. There are resources out there. There's curriculum, there's tutors, there's co-ops. A couple of years ago, I had my son I was just struggling with the algebra with him. Well, he was struggling with it. My daughter, so the oldest, she was really good at figuring out the algebra with the curriculum that she was using. She helped her next brother. And then by the time the youngest was to algebra, she was at a gap year program for a year. And so I didn't have her help. So I was like, okay, we joined a co-op, and there was an amazing math teacher. She did a different type of curriculum than I had been using, but he did so well underneath her tutoring him and walking him through that. So there are options out there. We don't have to know things. We just need to be resourceful.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good reminder for so much of parenting too. Like we don't have to know it all. We have resources. We get to outsource some things that we're not as good at, and then we get to focus on the things that we are good at and our strengths, and our kids will turn out okay if you don't do a million science experiments, or if you do.
Exactly.
Um, okay, one thing that I feel like people talk about all the time with homeschool kids, and I'm sure that people have said all the time, is how do they socialize?
Right.
Like that is like the concern that people have. And I feel like at this point, I mean, most people know that that is not a true statement, but like what has that looked like in your family? And what have been the benefits for socialization of homeschool?
Right. As you started asking that question, I knew exactly the word that was going to come out of your
I
mouth.
know, right? Because everybody is like, they need it to be socialized. They have to go to school. Yeah.
Yeah, well, let me start telling this story that it is just something that is so cliche that people think of. So my daughter was probably about 13, and it was after church, and God blessed me with not remembering who this person was that she spoke to. I just remember it was a woman from church. They had like a 15-minute conversation about all kinds of things, not just like the weather, but all kinds of things. And I could hear, they were within earshot, so I could hear what they were talking about. And just a back and forth. It wasn't like a quizzing. It wasn't like the woman was quizzing her. They were talking about, my daughter enjoys writing and reading, and they were talking about all this stuff. And then at the end, I guess my daughter happened to mention that she was homeschooled. They finished talking and depart from each other. And the woman came over to me and said, your daughter said that you homeschool. How do you handle socialization? Are you concerned about that? And my jaw was hit the floor. It's like, you just spoke to her for 15 minutes, and you didn't even know she was homeschooled till she said something at the end. And it sounded like you were having a very pleasant conversation. And I was like, so I think it's really the definition. Like, how do you define what is socialization? And so I look at it as being able to interact with a lot of different people. And yes, there's going to be some difficult people. There's some learning of how to interact with people, interacting one-on-one, in small groups, interacting in a large group. And most of our lives are spent with people of various ages and come from different backgrounds, and it can be very diverse. And we're not, I don't think ever outside of school, we are with people that were just born within 12 months of us.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that just being out in the world has really helped a lot. And so with socialization, we just kind of preferred them interacting with people of all different ages. And so we did do some co-ops where sometimes they were split up, but it was more so high schoolers all together or middle schoolers all together. So it was within a couple of years. And some co-ops were just everybody, and they had to do certain things and certain activities, or they paired them up as maybe a high schooler with an elementary school child, and they had to do a project or some type of presentation with them. And that was really neat for them to be able to learn how to exhibit grace to a younger child and to help them out. Overall, they just did life with me. They would go to the grocery store, they would go to the bank, they would run errands, they would come to Bible studies that I went to and sometimes they would come to these Bible studies, they were older, and they were the babysitters for the childcare for the younger kids. And we did a lot of volunteering. The neat thing was that we could volunteer and do that type of stuff during the day. And that allowed them to interact with a lot of adults. Specifically, it was something I remember for a few years we did some type of meal ministry thing at church. And I got there with the kids and we're all kind of helping. And I was like, okay, too many hands in the kitchen here. And so I just stepped out. I ended up just bringing them and reading a book and sitting in a corner and reading so that they would then have the opportunity to actually do the volunteering and the making and the preparing of the meals and interacting with the various adults that were actually doing it as well. So it's kind of neat. They do have some relationships with those people, and that's been kind of special. Overall church, and then as they get older, they start getting jobs. At 15, my son wanted to get a job and having to learn how to be around all kinds of people of all different ages. He worked at a grocery store, so it was a lot of different people. So it's really looking at it as a holistic kind of approach of how can I give my kids opportunities to learn how to be in the world.
Yeah, I always have viewed the socialization piece of homeschool to be one of the biggest benefits because I just think it's so important to be able to talk to adults. And when you go to school all day long, you have to interact with your teachers, obviously, but it's more of a person of authority instead of just a person that you're volunteering with or spending time with. So I think it's such a benefit and a really unique opportunity for kids. So I always do get a little confused by that question that people ask, but it's
Yeah,
just a different mindset and it's what people just aren't used to. But as more
right.
and more people homeschool, I feel like that will change a little bit since homeschooling is getting so much more popular than it was however
It is.
many
I
years
love
ago.
that you see that it's a benefit.
Yeah.
That makes my heart happy. Thank you. Because
Well,
so many people are just very combative about it. And I think it's just as a common, I think it's a question that's just perpetuated because they don't know what else to ask. They don't know to ask anything else. I'm like, why don't you ask what they enjoy learning about or what their favorite time period or what they're reading right now? Those kinds of
yeah.
questions instead of the question about socialization.
Yeah. Well, and I think people just have a misunderstanding of what homeschooling is because they think kind of like how you started is it's just going to be a classroom but at home instead of having the flexibility and, getting out and doing more real life things and learning that way. So, it's just a mindset change, I think, but
I
yeah.
agree. I agree. And
Yeah.
it might also go back to homeschooling, thinking about homeschooling in the 80s when it was possibly illegal and you would stay home. You didn't want people to see that your kids didn't get on the
Mhm.
bus. So
Yeah.
I don't know if it kind of comes from that mindset as well.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense too. Okay, besides people being very confused about what you're doing, what are some of the actual challenges that you've experienced in homeschooling or that a lot of people do go through? And then how do you kind of work through that?
For me and my personality, one of the big things was the fact that everybody was always home and I didn't get a break from kids. So when we first started homeschooling, my husband would work third shift. And when he wasn't working and he was home, he was a little bit brain dead, and
Mhm.
it would take him a while to get into it. On the weekends, he was very active in helping us out, and then we ended up moving, and he ended up working from home. And I was like, everybody's always here, and I don't get a moment of peace. I don't get time to be on my own, and I always felt like I was on duty and didn't have that break. So for me, it was just having a little bit of quiet time was a big challenge, and I had definitely some down moments, and my husband would recognize that, and I would even say like I need to be proactive about this and I need
Mm.
to take some time before I get to like crazy mom setting. It's not pretty. So I would take some random evening. I was like, I'm going to go out tonight. I'll make sure dinner is for you guys, but I'm going to go out and grab a bite to eat, or I'm going to go out just to Target, wander the aisles. I'm going to go to a park with a book and
Target.
read. Yeah. Something, whatever I kind of felt like was going to fill me up a bit. And that really helped. And probably those years, they felt very long. And it was probably maybe about 10 of those homeschooling years for me was like that, having to be very intentional about taking time for myself. Now as my kids have gotten older, they're not necessarily as emotionally needy. It kind of hit a feverish pitch when everybody needed to be driven around everywhere. But then I kind of would find time where I would drive somebody and I was like, well, by the time I drive home, I have to come back. And so my time alone would be sitting in the car reading a book for 30 minutes during a piano lesson or something like that. Just having to realize that that season wasn't going to last forever. And now my kids are off and out and about. And I remember a couple of summers ago, I had the first day in many, many years where they all went to work at the same time. And I was at home. And I was like, this is really weird.
Mhm.
So I had to like figure out what does that exactly look like. But I would say that's a big thing is just moms just feeling overwhelmed because even when you have just little ones, even before you maybe decide to homeschool, you have a baby, you have a toddler, you have a preschooler, and they're just very needy. And I'm not saying in elementary, if all the kids are elementary age, that they're as needy. It's just different types of needs and different
Yeah.
types of discipleship and discipline and being on in a different type of way. So I would say for me, that was probably the biggest thing. And I hear that a lot from homeschool moms too. And I think the other one would be for other homeschool moms is just not feeling like you are smart enough or feeling like
Mm.
you are able to provide them with a rigorous education. Like, listen, it's 2025. Anybody can provide them with a rigorous education. And if you don't feel like you can, there's so many resources out there. And just a big thing is just to pray. Just ask God
Mm.
to just fill you with the patience, with the wisdom, with the resources and the direction. And before every homeschool year, I just highly recommend just spending time in prayer, considering how you should spend your time because there are a lot of resources out there. There are a lot of activities, but we can't do it all. And when we try, we get burned out. And then mom, gets a little burned out and she needs those evenings alone or she needs just a little bit of time to herself. So, yeah, so those two things I would say were two of the biggest challenges and obstacles that moms face.
Yeah, I feel like that would be me if I was a homeschool mom. I'd be like, "We're gonna do everything, and we're gonna do all the curriculum, and we're gonna do all these field trips and activities," and then I would just have a complete meltdown at some point, and then be like,
Yeah,
"Well, obviously." But I mean, you want to do it all, and you want what's best for your kids, and you want to make sure you're doing it all right, just like in any part of parenting. And then you add in their academic life to it, and that's a lot of pressure.
it is. Oh, that's such a good point to make of the pressure. I think we have a lot of pressure that we put on ourselves. I don't always look at that as a bad thing because I think
Mhm.
when we put pressure on ourselves as a mom, it just means that we are trying to be intentional and we aren't just being reactionary. We're trying to be proactive in what we're doing. Just like in motherhood, and we're not going to be able to get to everything that we ever wanted to do. We kind of focus on what are our priorities. And so with the
Right.
homeschooling, it's what are the priorities? I mean, I think back now even to like, what would I wish I could take my kids to all these field trips, and my 22 and 20-year-old are like, I don't know. I don't really have time to go on a field trip to, I don't know, some historic site or something like that. So there's always going to be things that we wish we could get to, but it's just doing what we can and then just understanding that there's limited time and God will just he'll fill in the gaps of the things that we feel like we miss out on.
Yeah, that's a good point. So as your kids are, you have two who are done. You have one who's finishing up. Like as you reflect back and you look at your 14 years of homeschooling, like how have you seen your kids grow in the unique ways that homeschooling offers, like both academically and spiritually and just personally?
Yeah, this is a great question. I really think that homeschooling has helped shape my kids as to who they are now today. They are fiercely independent and, for better or for worse, fiercely opinionated as well. My mom says, I have never, even when they were younger, I have never met more opinionated kids. But it also it's because they have been exposed to so many things. And we talk about so much because we're together all the time and they've seen a lot more of life than they maybe would have otherwise. And so it's shaped them academically in the fact that they all love to learn. Doesn't mean they all love to learn the same things.
Mm.
It doesn't mean that they all are wired the same way. So God gives every person specific gifts, talents, and abilities and ways that we can carry that out in the world. And so all three of my kids are so different and it blows me away at times. And it was neat to be able to, especially in high school. I felt like in elementary school, there was the foundation that you're laying and it was all pretty much the same. I would just use the same curriculum. When the next one got to third grade, they would just use the same exact curriculum because that's what worked. Middle school, we had a little bit more flexibility, and then high school, we had credits to meet, but I would do that differently depending upon the child and what maybe for the history. So in the state of New York, you have to have a certain amount of credits that count towards, I think they call it social studies. And so you can decide, is that world history? Is that US history? What does that look like? So finding resources, but then also all of their electives were specifically geared towards them as to
Hmm.
what they were interested in. And so my daughter was very interested in anatomy and physiology and health and alternative health. And so she took courses online that weren't necessarily for homeschoolers by the end of homeschooling because that's what she's interested in. She also enjoyed writing and she did do some college courses, some dual enrollment for that. And then my older son, he was really interested in entrepreneurship. So he's 20 and he owns his own business right now. And so we focused a lot for him on entrepreneurship and what maybe he would need. I remember him taking specifically a accounting class for business owners. And that really helped him at least to start out. Now he's like, I could probably write an accounting course and, it gets so much more in depth, but it really allowed him flexibility for that. And so at my youngest, he's at that age now. So 11th grade, we've done a lot of exploring. And so it's looking, what are you possibly interested in? What's the next steps for you? And how can we maybe start that and support that right now? So we've gone to colleges. We've talked to different business owners. We've checked out all kinds of things. We took him to the local tech school to see what different options they are. And so he's kind of starting to land in a certain area. And I'm like, okay, what are some opportunities and how can we create some elective courses for this? So academically, I've just seen that they love learning and that as they've gotten older, we've really been able to niche in and they're not going into the next steps of life completely blind as to what their gifts, talents, and abilities are. So
I think that's just such a unique, cool thing about homeschooling that you just get to, when they're little, you get to pick curriculum and how you teach things based on how they're going to learn it and what their learning styles looks like. But then when they get older, you get to pick, those are cool electives. They're actually very useful for life. There's
yeah,
always the joke about, you see the joke every year around tax season. They're like, I don't know how to do my taxes, but I know how to line dance or whatever. All these things you learn in school that you're like, that's not overly helpful. But you get to pick all that when you homeschool.
yeah, exactly. I think one of the great options that we did was doing a consumer math so that they understand. So my 17-year-old 11th grader is just about finishing up because I was like, well, you've done the algebra, you've done the geometry. Are you going to go into a math-minded career? He's just not looking at that. And if he is, then he could probably pick up all that really well. But the consumer math has really taught him. He's learned how to budget for groceries, how to budget for clothing, how to budget for a car, how to budget for vacations, things that
Yeah.
I had to learn as an adult. So it's really being able to pick the resources that you think are going to be good for your kids and looking at them right now at this time period, what's going to be really good for them to know now as they are growing up and into their next season of life.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, 2 questions to wrap up our time. First, what do you wish that you knew when you started out? If you could go back 14 years, what would you tell yourself?
Yeah, I would say an alert. I mean, there's a lot of little things. I could probably say, don't do that curriculum. It's not going to work out well. But by doing that, I realized, well, that's not really our style of homeschooling. That didn't really resonate with us. But I would say the big thing would be to realizing that homeschool is an entire lifestyle. It's the way that we live, and we can pull our kids into the way that we live. An example of this would be when we moved states and my husband took a new job. He was doing some traveling, just day-long traveling. And our son, who is the force we reckoned with that I mentioned, he was in middle school. And it was really good for him to spend more time with dad. And so he would spend time with him. He would go on the date. They'd be gone all day. They would listen to business podcasts. And he would, have to dress nice because he had to go into these meetings and everything. And he would have an opportunity then because they would always be like, oh, and who are you? And he'd interact with adult men. And that really gave such a great foundation for him. And so it just realized that we can pull them into our worlds, that they can see what it's like to be an adult and how do we react in different situations and how do we carry ourselves. So really seeing it as an entire lifestyle, not just math, language arts, history, and science. We don't have to put it into compartments. We can actually learn all together and see how that all applies to life. So realizing that all this time, I can really focus on discipling their hearts and pouring into them, God's truth and teaching them theology. And my kids, by the time they graduate, from high school, I'm like, you could speak theologically. I mean, put me up against a theologian and I'll sound not so smart. But they can carry their own when it comes to adults and expressing their view on something and what scripture they use for that basis. And but also, I would say the other thing is I wish that I knew how much homeschooling would sanctify me instead of pushing against being like, I'm not patient enough and just angry that I wasn't patient enough, being like, this is the Holy Spirit revealing to me that I'm not patient enough in this area. And how can I grow in patience? Therefore, growing in patience in this area will also help me to grow in patience in other areas. And so if I look at myself way back then, I was a very impatient person. And now my young adult kids will be like, you're so super chill. And I'm like, you kind of get to this point. Like God's grown patience
That's
in me.
because of you.
Yeah. I have to say that. That's funny.
Yeah. Okay. And then my last question would be, what would you say to a parent who's listening to this and they're curious, but they're not quite sure if it's 100% right for their family?
Yeah, let's go back to the very beginning when I pointed out, let's just make a decision for right now for this year and see how this year goes. But also, maybe don't make your decision for whether you'll continue homeschooling based upon this year. There's a lot of growing pains and there's a huge learning curve. And when we especially go into it super focused on the academics and not saying, okay, we are now learning, especially if you're pulling kids home from school, the kids have to learn how to live differently, how their days are going to be differently. And especially if all of your kids were in school and mom has been home or working part-time or whatever, this is a whole new thing for mom as well, for mom and dad. And
Mhm.
so allowing just a little bit of time. So say, let's give this a try. But if it's a little rough and have your ups and downs at the end of the year, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it beyond that, that you shouldn't go ahead and try another year, because literally every single year is different. Every child is slightly older. You are slightly older and hopefully wiser and understand things a little bit better and feel more comfortable with homeschool. I think I see a great drop off of parents when they decide to stop homeschooling somewhere around year 4 or 5 of homeschooling. It
Mhm.
just starts to feel overwhelming and that you can't do it. I say push through, because it's like anything that's hard. If you're trying to get back into shape, and it's going to feel hard at times. So if you just continue to push through, you'll get to the other side. And then you're like, okay, I'm starting to see some changes. I'm starting to see maybe some muscle. I'm starting to see that I'm stronger, that my clothes are fitting better. And same with the homeschool. You'll start to say, okay, we are starting to see a difference. And sometimes it's not because of the academics we're having a rough time. It's because of the hearts of our children, and the sinfulness of both of all of us is being exposed. And lean into that and work through that. The academics then comes. If there's a lot of issues with behavior and their heart and who knows, whatever it is. I mean, my kids all went through different things of lying and cheating their way through math and stuff like that. But it was an opportunity. Yeah, I've got some stories. It was an opportunity for me to then see that and being able to address that with them and leading them to Christ for that.
Yeah. You mean they were like normal kids, lying
Yes,
and cheating?
absolutely. We all got to try it a little bit, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's part of growing up, right? It's trying all that stuff, pushing boundaries, doing all the things. Yeah. But thank you so much. I feel like this was so helpful and I mean, we covered a lot of ground in 40 minutes. So thank you so much for sharing just your story and your experience and all of your wisdom. I think it'll be really helpful for people. Where can people connect with you or keep in touch?
Absolutely. So you can go to my website, Little by Little Homeschool. I also have a podcast. So wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can just look up Little by Little Homeschool. And I share from a perspective of a homeschooling mom. It's a mixture of academics as well as just like, what does life look like for homeschoolers? And you can find me on Facebook and Instagram, whatever your favorite social media is.
Perfect. I'll get all that in show notes too, so people can find you. Yeah.
Good.
Thank you so much for being with us. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Christian parenting.